Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A playing card decorated with an original miniature painted by the artist Hans Holbein was sold at a London auction for more than $13,000. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a fabulous talent. Sir Walter Perrott, the organ virtuoso, made his debut at the age of 7 and was the organist of St. George's Chapel in Windsor, England for 42 years. He was a musician of tremendous concentration. In 1862, for example, when he was just 21 years old, he gave a concert of the masters blindfolded and at the same time played 2 games of chess behind his back and won both games. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Wakanda Springs in Kansas has salt water, a tide that rises and falls, yet it's 600 miles from the sea. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the strangest criminal code in the world. Ancient and primitive societies have always dealt strongly with their womenfolk. Either they were veiled or silent or belittled in one way or another. But these family rules are nothing compared to the laws in Pontianak, an island off the west coast of Borneo. In this delightful community, it's a capital crime to save a woman from drowning. It's the way they express their pride that their women are the best swimmers in the world. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
To cure double chins in early England, beauty parlors would haul a woman into the air by a strap beneath her jaw. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who made a strange decision. Roger Atkinson Pryor of Petersburg, Virginia, was made an offer that few men would have had the courage to refuse. He was offered an appointment as a brigadier general in the Confederate Army by General Joseph E. Johnston. But he politely yet firmly refused, stating that the Army had too many generals as it is. Its real need is more private soldiers. Pryor served as a buck private throughout the Civil War. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Benjamin Milam, noted Texas hero, was the only person to own a United States river. Congress gave him the Colorado River in 1835. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a prince's cruelty. It probably didn't matter whether the old fellow was a good ruler or not. The issue was that he seemed to be on the verge of ruling forever. He was King Alangsitu of ancient Burma, who ruled from 1075 to 1160, a remarkably long reign of 85 years. King Alangsitu would have ruled even longer, but he was murdered by his own son, Narathu, who was afraid his father would rule forever. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
William D. Graham sat in the same chair on his golden wedding anniversary that his father and grandfather sat in on their golden wedding anniversaries. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a labor of love. The town of Bunzlau in Silesia, Germany, which specializes in pottery, is still proud of a gigantic piece of crockery fashioned by a lovelorn potter's assistant in 1753. To gain the hand of his master's daughter, the young assistant created a huge pot, which so impressed the citizens of the town that they talked the father into letting his daughter marry the young man. The pot was even adopted as the city emblem. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Whether he was history's greatest mercenary or just liked to fight in wars, Nicholas Franz Bachmann is unique. He was a general in the armies of 5 different countries: France, Sardinia, Austria, England, and Switzerland. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a tale of espionage. Prince von Kaunitz, Chancellor of Austria in the 18th century, was a man whose life was racked with fears and suspicions. His informers told him a spy, identity unknown, had been planted among a group of government officials. The informers knew he was one of 4 men who enjoyed rowing together on Sundays on the Danube. The prince ordered all 4 men drowned, knowing that as he killed the spy, he also killed 3 innocent men. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The crypt holding the ashes of John A. Brashear, the famous maker of lenses, and the ashes of his wife, is located under the telescope of the Allegheny Observatory in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a man whose life ended with incredible fate. Antonio Biancani, an 18th century banker of Milan, Italy, was born in a cell in the state prison where both his parents had been imprisoned in 1699. Later, after his release, he rose to high rank in the banking profession and became involved in politics. Accused by the courts on a charge of treason, Biancani was sent to jail and incredibly went to his death from the same cell where he was born. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Mrs. Charlotte Wisconsin Van Cleve, by being born in what then was an early U.S. territory in 1819, was actually born in 4 of the United States: Iowa, Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Wyoming. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the most trustworthy man in history. The Caliph Walid ruled in Syria in the 8th century. Most rulers in that time were cruel and cunning, but the Caliph was trustworthy and fair. When it was time to pay for the construction of the $29 million Omyad Mosque in Damascus, the Caliph refused to believe anyone would be dishonest in building a temple to God. He paid the bills and ordered them burned without looking at them. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The Svobodniki, a Russian sect of British Columbia, eat no meat, eggs, fowl, or dairy products. They don't use leather or wool and do all their work by hand. It's against the religion to make use of any animal's labor or product. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a tragic love story. Mary Pugsley of Bristol, England, spent a lifetime in mourning. Her husband, who was called to battle in the siege of Bristol in 1645, was killed the afternoon of the day they were married. Mary spent the rest of her life as a widow. Her sorrow never left her, for on her deathbed, 60 years later, Mary made a strange request. She asked that she be buried in the dress she wore at her wedding. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
William Billinge was born in a cornfield in Longner, England, lived a very full life, and died 112 years later in the same cornfield. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the touching story of an American patriot with a strange deathbed wish. Robert E. Craddock was a patriot to the core and proved it up to his dying day. Craddock, a Revolutionary War veteran of Warren County, Kentucky, was about to die in 1837 when he made the following preparations. He got out of his deathbed, donned his Revolutionary War uniform, asked for a piper and a drummer to march around his house playing military airs, so that the last sounds on earth Craddock would hear were his beloved regimental marches. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Pygmy brides in the African mountains of the moon add another oddity to the many tribal rites involving marriage. These ladies, on their wedding day, paint a replica of high-button shoes on their legs. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a queen with a very short memory. A lady who looked lightly on love was Catherine Tudor of 16th century Wales. This cold-blooded woman accepted proposals of marriage from two suitors during the funeral of her first husband. Not only that, when her second husband died, she married Sir Richard Clough, having assured him at the grave of her first husband that she'd marry him at the death of her second. Catherine also buried Sir Richard without mourning and married a fourth time. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Colonel Harry Smith, who has a city named after him in South Africa, once saved a town under siege by 15,000 bloodthirsty natives by riding horseback 100 miles a day for 6 days. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a ruler who spent most of his life in jail. In the rocky political history of Turkey, there is no stranger story than the one about Sultan Mohammed VI. He was placed under strict detention at the age of 4 months. While the political scenes shifted outside, Mohammed remained a prisoner inside. In 1918, after Mohammed had been a prisoner for 57 years, he finally became Sultan, the last Sultan of Turkey. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Alexander Grant, the celebrated Scottish poet, was 7 feet tall and was so unbelievably strong he could crush in his fist a handful of the practically unbreakable shells of sea snails. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of the ruler whose debt was paid with beautiful girls. In Betanzos, Spain, there's a small bridge built in 1200 A.D. It seems the King of Castile, because of an obligation imposed upon him by the Caliph of Cordoba, was forced to furnish 100 female slaves each year to the Caliph. Tiring of this wasted womanhood, the king built the bridge, which signaled the end of his obligation. Even today, the bridge is still called the Bridge of the Young Ladies. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Of all the animals hunted for food, one of the most versatile is the twin-horned gemsbok. This animal is sought not only for meat, but for water. The gemsbok stores a supply of pure drinking water inside his body. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a man with colossal nerve. Sir John Price, it seems, was so grief-stricken by the death of his first wife, he kept her embalmed body in the bedroom for 11 years, even after he'd taken one Mary Morris as his second wife. After the death of Mary, he had her embalmed body installed in the same bedroom. But soon Sir John was convinced that dead wives in the bedroom wasn't the best way to show one's grief. Who changed his mind? Wife number 3. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Leonard Rosey, a Parisian playboy, proved he was a man without nerves. He proved it by shooting a bullseye with his pistol while inside a cage of ferocious lions. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a man's experience in death. David Owen, a celebrated 18th century harpist, was on his deathbed and had sunk into a deep coma. His family thought he was dead. But Owen awoke and asked for his harp. He said he'd heard a heavenly tune and wanted to play it before he died. His mother copied the music as he played, and as the last note died away, so did Owen. Thus, this gifted harpist became the only musician in history who composed his own dirge on his deathbed. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The Chapel of St. Nicholas on the island of Santorin is the only ancient temple in all of Greece that's been preserved intact. This perfect building, a former pagan sanctuary, is 2,300 years old. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the prophetic stonecutter. Robert Russell, a stonecutter who lived in New Tannards, Ireland, chipped and hammered at the epitaph. It was on a pillar in the local abbey. Russell was 27 years old, and the epitaph he was cutting was his own. Probably because he had time on his hands, because at the time he was in perfect health. Yet, a few days after the young stonecutter finished his own epitaph, he died. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Tsar Nicholas I of Russia was so moved by a poem read to him by its author, Alexander Poleziev, he began to cry. But in the next moment, the Tsar coldly sentenced the poet to life imprisonment on a charge of treason. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the ritual of pain. A cabinet meeting among the Tobori tribe in the African territory of Chad is anything but quiet and dignified, particularly when it's time to inaugurate a new chieftain. At this important and ceremonial event, the cabinet officers gather round the chief-elect and beat the man with clubs for a solid hour. If he endures the savage clubbing in stoic silence, he's considered by the cabinet to be worthy of the office. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Girls in Nidwalden, Switzerland don't waste any time in making known they're marriageable. The girls wear a single pin in their hair that's shaped exactly like a Cupid's arrow. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a bar bill that led to a fiery disaster. The castle of Runkelstein, Italy, suffered an extraordinary fate. A friend of its owner, Duke Frederick of Tyrol, had run up a bar bill of $20 and found himself unable to pay. He sent a messenger to Runkelstein Castle asking his friend for a loan. He said he'd give the money only if the Duke appeared in person. The Duke never forgave his friend for this insult, and he later attacked the castle with an army and destroyed it. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Designing clothes for a fisherman from Nazare, Portugal can't be too much of a problem as far as pockets are concerned. These people only have one pocket, and that one is in their hat. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a ship that was destined for disaster. The schooner George F. Whitney, commanded by Captain Carpenter, was a doomed ship from the time she was built. On her first voyage, she was wrecked on Sugar Island in the Great Lakes. On her second trip, she was shattered at Vermilion, Ohio. Her luck continued bad. And on her third voyage, the George F. Whitney vanished during a storm on Lake Michigan with all hands and was never heard from again. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The official staff of the mayor of a village in Czechoslovakia is carved in the shape of a human arm with the index finger and thumb curved in the characteristic American sign for OK, believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a man who never forgot his brush with death. Robert Quirk, an English ship owner, was caught in a storm-riddled voyage on the Bay of Biscay. His ship was being battered to pieces, and he vowed that if he and his ship ever survived, he would show his thanksgiving in an everlasting way. And he did. Returning to Minehead, England safely, Quirk dismantled his boat and used its lumber to build 11 poorhouses, which still stand today, 3 centuries later, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The post offices in rural Celebes, Indonesia, have a simple yet unique way of identifying the mail. A special delivery letter, for example, always has a rooster's feather attached to it. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man's glimpse of life. Dennis O'Hampsey lives as a legend in Ireland for 2 reasons. First, he was a talented and beloved harpist. Second, O'Hampsey had lost his eyesight at the age of 3. For 109 years, he was unable to open his eyes. But in the last moments of life, while playing his harp, his eyes suddenly fluttered open. And then O'Hampsey, the blind harpist, died with his eyes wide open. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Is it possible to bowl 299 and a half? James T. Blackstone did. On his last roll, 1 pin split, and half of it remained standing. Score, 299 and a half. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a man with a curious attitude about clothes. Dr. John Blackwood of Mount Holly, New Jersey, was a successful physician, judge, and postmaster. He left over $30,000 to his heirs. Yet the good doctor had a curious attitude about how money should be spent. On clothes, for example, Dr. Blackwood was particularly frugal. In his entire lifetime, he never owned more than 1 shirt. And while this was being laundered, he remained in bed. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A house in St. Nicholas, Wales, in which famed Oliver Cromwell spent 1 night, was so respected by the family of a neighboring castle that for 300 years, each member of the family tipped his hat when passing the structure. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about one of the strangest armies of all time. When Lieutenant Jean Perrier of Estavayer-le-Lac, Switzerland, retired from military service, he took up a strange hobby. The officer was a brilliant tactician and master of military drill. In retirement, Perrier organized a drill team that performed a manual of arms to perfection and crisp, close-order drill. His drill team, however, wasn't composed of men. It was a regiment of frogs. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A king of the Bamalik tribe in Africa is always buried with a bamboo tube in his mouth so his thirsty spirit can be refreshed with wine once a week. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the fascinating story of a group of people who you wouldn't care to have as friends. Among the many strange religious sects of India are the holy men of the Jaina sect. They never wear shoes, nor do they eat between sunset and sunrise. They can only shape their hair and beards by plucking the hair out by the roots. And strangest of all is their concern about insects. They'll never light a fire if it endangers insects, and actually bandage their mouths to prevent them from inhaling and harming germs and flies. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The famous author Jonathan Swift, who's remembered for his satirical novel Gulliver's Travels, left his entire fortune to be used to build an insane asylum. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a king who wanted to become a dancer. During a battle against a Christian army at Varna, Bulgaria, Amurath II, Sultan of Turkey, made a vow that if he were victorious, he would abdicate his throne and become a whirling dervish. After his victory, he did indeed turn over the crown to his son and become a dancer. 2 years later, he was recalled to the throne and ruled another 6 years. But he always maintained he was happier as a whirling dervish than he was as a Turkish king. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
There was no mistaking the iron hand of Baudouin I, the Duke of Flanders. Once when he was attacked by a powerful bear, he strangled the beast with his bare hands. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a family's way of mourning. One of the truly touching examples of the love found in a family is to be found among the Yoruba tribe of Nigeria in Africa. If a member of the tribe has twins, and one of the twins dies while it's still an infant, the surviving twin carries a wooden statue of the dead twin around on its back. The dead twin's likeness is dressed like the living twin, and every day this doll-like statue is given the same food and drink. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A whale harpooned off the coast of Australia in 1886 was landed on the whaler John and Winthrop only after the monster had bitten 2 whale boats in half. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a tortured act of faith. To atone for an act of disrespect shown to his teacher, an Indian named Andrana traveled from Madura to the holy town of Badrinath on the Tibetan border, a distance of 1,600 miles in 4 years. Instead of walking, he would fall continuously on the ground, rise and fall again for the entire journey. On the return trip, he neither sat or lay down, but slept, tied to a post. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A 300-pound tuna fish tagged in the Bahamas was caught some 4 months later near the port city of Bergen, Norway, a distance of 4,500 miles. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who overcame the most unbelievable handicap. Carl Dewey Myers, who died in 1951, was the Poet Laureate of West Virginia for 10 years. He committed to memory the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, the Mayflower Compact, and the Magna Carta. Not bad for a normal fellow, but Carl Myers was born a cripple, a dwarf who never weighed more than 60 pounds and never had a day's schooling in his life. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The grave of Lawrence Sterne, one of England's most famous authors, does not contain his bones. The corpse was stolen by robbers 2 days after he was buried. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a real vote-getter. When the headlines blare about the smooth and shrewd doings of political leaders, it's interesting to remember one William Fitzhardinge, who lived in 19th century England. Fitzhardinge was a real vote-getter, handsome, sure of himself, a natural for the game of politics. In fact, Fitzhardinge was so good, his efforts were rewarded by an earldom. Who made him an earl? His 4 brothers, whom he got elected to Parliament all in the same year. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
One of the most successful authors in history was Reverend Charles H. Spurgeon of London, England. He sold more than 50 million copies of his sermons. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the way a woman in Africa shows off her new husband. The stories of the Amazons, the tough, strong, and formidable women of the jungles, are rarely love stories. But there is love among the Amazons, in spite of a slight difference in style. The Amazons, for example, who guarded the kings of Dahomey in West Africa, could marry only with their monarch's permission. But the strangest part of the love story is how the husband is shown off to the tribe, seated in a basket that the bride carries around on her head. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The tombstone on the grave of Thomas Weir in Belfast, Ireland, is something of a landmark. At his own request, Weir's tombstone is the marble fireplace from his home. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a village that murdered itself. 300 years ago, the small village of Katzenwangen in the Alsatian region of France was a gay and thriving community. However, a strange and deathly epidemic struck Katzenwangen, killing in days every man, woman, and child in the town. Yet the cause of the epidemic, the poisonous village water well, is still standing. Monument to a city's doom. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
If you were to subtract 40 from the number of cricket chirps a minute and divide the result by 4, then add 50 to that result, you would be able to tell the temperature without a thermometer. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the strange heritage of our railroads. Practically the entire civilized world now uses the standard railroad gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. This width was used by the Roman chariots with which Julius Caesar's army invaded Britain in 55 B.C. They were copied by the native Celts, with the result that deep ruts of that width were worn on English roads in the course of centuries. Today, more than 2,000 years after Caesar's invasion, modern vehicles roll on these indelible chariot tracks. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
When you hear the expression, packed in like sardines, here's something to think about. The more sardines packed in a can, the greater the profit. Olive oil is more expensive than the fish. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how the White House got its name. When George Washington met and wooed Martha Custis, she owned a plantation on the Pamunkey River in Virginia, which she inherited from her first husband. The manor was known as the White House. It was in this White House that the father of our country found his greatest domestic happiness. Many years later, when the executive mansion was built, Washington suggested that it be called the White House, to commemorate a romantic and sentimental notion. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Joe Mendy, an orangutan at the Detroit Zoo, filed a federal income tax report for 1933. His gross income was $3,800. He claimed an exemption of $2,000, listing his manager as a dependent. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the king who rides piggyback. The king of the Nkundo in the Belgian Congo is so sacrosanct that he is forbidden to stand, walk, sit on a chair, or squat on the ground. It's believed that if he did any of these things, the world would come to an end. So while he's king, he always rides piggyback on the shoulders of a special royal carrier, a man assigned to him for life. He is the king's throne, his transportation, and his couch. If he dies, the king's reign ends. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
We can't tell you which came first, the chicken or the egg, but it is possible to ascertain whether an egg will produce a hen or a rooster. Hen eggs are rounded. Rooster eggs are pointed. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the very unusual story of a general's secret. Dr. James Barry of Edinburgh was the granddaughter of a Scottish earl. As the result of an unfortunate love affair, she decided to pose as a man. She entered the Army in 1813 and rose to the rank of general in the Army Medical Corps. She served in the British Army for 52 years and died in London. Not until after her death was the secret of her sex discovered. She even fooled a servant who'd been close to her for 50 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The first Air Express delivery was made 955 years ago. The Caliph Aziz of Cairo sent a rush order for cherries to the town of Baalbek. 600 pigeons made the delivery. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the unusual story of a caliph who counted the days he was happy. The Caliph Abdurrahman III ruled the most powerful empire in the world for 49 years. He had an annual income of $336 million. He had 6,321 wives, the most beautiful women of his empire. He was wise and led a life of fabulous magnificence. Yet in his will he wrote, "All during my long and glorious reign I have counted the days when I enjoyed complete happiness and found them to have numbered only 141. Believe it or not."
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Belle Rhines of Savannah, Georgia, suffered from asthma for 101 years. Then she was cured and lived to the age of 123 years. She outlived her asthma. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a boy who received a kingdom for his table manners. In 1875, the throne of the Indian state of Baroda was vacant. The British authorized the wife of the last Maharaja to select a new ruler from among the young villagers of Kavlana. The Maharani decided to subject the boys to a test of table manners. A 12-year-old urchin was as crude as the rest, but smart enough to watch the Maharani and imitate her. She awarded the throne to him, and he ruled for 64 years as Gaekwar Sayajirao III. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
In Bikaner, India, the priest ties the marital knot by handcuffing the bride's hand to a cow's tail. When the cow says moo, or its Hindu equivalent, the marriage is concluded. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the deadly effect of a typographical error. Carlo Alessandro Guidi, Italian lyric poet and dramatist, translated the Book of Homilies, a 16th century English work, into immaculate Latin. As the first copy rolled off the presses, he hastened to the Vatican to present it to Pope Clement XI. On the way, he glanced at the page and was so mortified to find that the word sine, which means without, was spelled sin, that he went home and died of shock, victim of a typographical error. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Arthur B. Lester of Chicago was taken prisoner in North Africa in 1942 by a German who took his wristwatch. 2 years later, Arthur's brother captured the same German in Normandy and recovered the watch. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a woman who had lived a lifetime at 20. Isabel of France probably crowded more events within her brief lifespan than any other woman in history. At the age of 2, she was engaged to marry John, Count of Alençon. Instead of marrying her fiancé, she married King Richard II of England when she was only 7. She became a widow at the age of 11 and married again at 16. Her second husband was Charles of Angoulême. She died in childbirth at the age of 20. Believe it or not.